A black woman gave up her hard-earned first-class seat for a pregnant stranger. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't need recognition. She simply followed the quiet voice of her conscience. It seemed like a small act, the kind you might forget by the end of the day. But that simple gesture planted the seed of a powerful friendship. And without knowing it, she stepped into a story far bigger than herself. The gate beeped as Aisha Johnson scanned her ticket. First class. She stepped into the cabin, heels quiet against the plush carpet, her leather bag slung over one shoulder. A dozen heads turned, some with polite disinterest, some lingering just a little too long. She felt it. She always felt it. But she didn't shrink. This seat wasn't given, she reminded herself, sliding into 2A. It was earned. The cabin buzzed with the soft murmur of conversations and the clink of glasses. Sunlight spilled through the oval windows, painting the cabin in a warm, golden haze. Flight attendants moved like clockwork, offering sparkling water and folded newspapers. A jolt. The engines hummed louder. Takeoff. Aisha adjusted her seatbelt, closing her eyes for a brief moment, until movement in the aisle caught her attention. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, stood awkwardly between rows. Her hands clutched her swollen belly, her face flushed with exhaustion. A few passengers glanced up, then quickly looked away. Whispers, a cough, a rustle of papers. No one moved. The woman's legs wobbled slightly as the plane tilted upward. Still no one moved. Aisha didn't hesitate. She unbuckled, stood up in one smooth motion, and offered a soft smile. "Here," she said, her voice cutting gently through the silence. "Take my seat." The woman's eyes widened in shock, then gratitude. Without waiting for applause or second thoughts, Aisha grabbed her bag, steadied the woman into 2A, and made her way down the aisle toward the back, where the cabin grew narrower, noisier, less forgiving. As she squeezed into a middle seat between two strangers, knees brushing the seat in front of her, Aisha exhaled. A small breath of peace. It wasn't about comfort, it was about doing what was right, even when no one else would. For a moment, no one breathed. The woman in the aisle shifted her weight, one hand pressing into the curve of her back, her other hand trembling slightly as she clung to the seat nearest her. Aisha felt the eyes, the quick, sharp glances, the deliberate looks away. A first-class cabin, a sanctuary of privilege, frozen under the weight of discomfort. Without a sound, Aisha pushed her tray table up and unbuckled her belt. Her movement was smooth, deliberate, a ripple through the stillness. She rose to her feet, her navy blazer catching the soft golden cabin light. Her voice was low, almost musical, calm, unhurried. "Here," Aisha said, her words clear and sure, slicing through the hesitant air. "You should sit." The woman blinked as if unsure whether kindness could be real in a place like this. Aisha offered a small, encouraging nod, and with a grateful, shaky smile, the woman eased into the wide, cushioned seat. Around them, a strange kind of hush lingered, the kind that happens when people witness something they should have done, but didn't. Aisha caught a glimpse of a man 2 rows up. His tie loosened, his hand still resting on the armrest he hadn't lifted. No thanks, no applause, just silence. Aisha adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and turned toward the back of the plane. The first steps felt oddly heavy, as if the air itself resisted her, pushing her away from the comfort she had rightly earned. She passed through the sleek boundary that separated first class from economy. The lighting shifted, cooler, harsher, less forgiving. The seats grew smaller, the chatter louder, the aisle narrower. When she finally squeezed into an empty middle seat near the rear, Aisha sat down carefully, tucking her elbows close to her sides. The man to her left was already snoring softly. The woman to her right was scrolling through her phone, barely noticing. The seat pressed hard against her knees. The armrests boxed her in. The recycled air seemed thinner here, but inside Aisha there was only calm. No resentment, no regret. A quiet warmth settled into her chest, stronger somehow than the plushness of any first-class cushion. She leaned her head back against the stiff headrest, closed her eyes, and let the soft hum of the engines carry her forward. Some things she thought were worth far more than legroom. The terminal buzzed with noise, rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, the sharp scent of coffee and fuel blending into a blur. Aisha pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her mind already drifting toward the long day ahead. She almost didn't hear her name. "Miss Johnson?" She turned. Standing a few steps away were the woman from the plane and a man beside her, tall, earnest, eyes full of urgency. It was the way they looked at her, not awkward, not invasive, but with a kind of raw, open gratitude that stopped her in her tracks. "I'm Lily," the woman said, her voice still a little breathless. "And this is my husband, Mark. We just wanted to thank you for what you did back there." Aisha smiled a little shyly. It was nothing. But to them, it clearly wasn't. "Please, Victus," Mark added, stepping forward, his hand half raised like a question he was afraid to ask. "Let us buy you dinner. It would mean a lot to us." Aisha hesitated. Her watch ticked against her wrist. She had meetings to prepare for, calls to answer. And yet, something in Lily's face, the tired lines of recent grief, the heavy shadows under her eyes, reached her in a way that logic couldn't explain. "All right," Aisha said, tucking her bag under her arm. "Dinner sounds good." The restaurant was tucked away on a side street, the kind of place you could miss if you weren't looking carefully. Its windows glowed with soft amber light, painting the sidewalk in warm hues. Inside, the clatter and chill of the airport vanished, replaced by the low murmur of conversation and the rich smell of baking bread. They chose a corner booth. The table was small, the candle flickering between them, casting gentle shadows on the worn wooden walls. Over plates of pasta and warm bread, the story poured out. Lily's father, Upin, a man who had built a modest import-export business from scratch, had passed away just 3 months earlier, leaving behind more than just grief. "We thought the company was in good shape," Mark said, his voice tightening. "But after he died, we started finding things, gaps, missing money, loans we didn't know about." Lily twisted her napkin in her lap. "We're completely overwhelmed, and with the baby coming, it's just a lot." Aisha listened, the weight of their words settling into her chest. She knew the language of balance sheets and financial statements. She spoke it fluently, almost like breathing. But what she heard in their voices wasn't just confusion, it was fear. Mark leaned forward, his hand curling around his glass. "We don't know who to trust. Everyone's either trying to charge us a fortune or they talk over our heads." Lily looked at Aisha, her voice barely above a whisper. "You seem like someone who would tell us the truth." Silence hung between them for a moment, broken only by the faint clink of dishes from the kitchen. Aisha glanced down at her plate, her fork untouched. She thought of her own climb, how every step upward had been through a thicket of unseen hands, some offering help, most ready to pull her down. She thought of how rare real kindness was. When she looked up again, her decision was already made. "I'll help," she said simply. And just like that, a bridge formed, not of contracts or promises, but of something far rarer: trust. The city outside buzzed and pulsed, but inside her rented room, the world narrowed to a pool of golden light and the rustle of paper. Aisha sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, documents spread around her like fallen leaves. Bank statements, shipping invoices, contracts blurred by the shakiness of rushed signatures. The little desk lamp hissed softly, casting long shadows across the peeling walls. Her laptop chimed quietly each time she opened another file, another piece of a story she didn't yet understand. At first, it was small things, dates that didn't line up, payments just a little too large, invoices just a little too vague. But then she found them, a series of repeated transfers, tucked away like loose threads under layers of legitimate business. The same name over and over: Vernon Hayes. Her pulse quickened. She leaned closer, tracing the pattern with her fingertip across the screen. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. She sat back, breath shallow, the cold edge of something bigger pressing into her thoughts. And then, the knock. A sharp, hard rapping at the door. Aisha froze. Heart hammering. Another knock, this time softer. A slip of paper slid under the door, pale against the worn carpet. She stared at it, dread prickling down her spine. Finally, with trembling fingers, she reached for it. Just one line scrawled in thick black ink: "Stay away." The words felt heavy in her hand, heavier than any ledger or spreadsheet, Aisha locked the door, bolted it, pressed her back against it for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced, a tight whirl of fear, anger, and cold calculation. She could stop. She could walk away. No one would blame her. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Lily's exhausted smile, Mark's desperate hope, the unborn child, growing quietly in a world already too rough. No, she wasn't backing down. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, but Raman. The screen glowed in the dim room as she scrolled to the number Lily had given her earlier, a recommendation just in case. Clara Nguyen, attorney at law. Aisha tapped the call button. It rang once, twice. Then a calm, professional voice answered. Clara Nguyen speaking. Aisha didn't waste time. There's something wrong, she said, keeping her voice low, steady. And I think someone knows I'm digging. Within minutes, Clara had arranged the next steps. A private investigator. Discretion. Precautions. The next morning, Aisha slipped out into the city streets, bundled in a simple gray coat. The air was crisp, the sky a cold slate overhead. And yet, every footstep behind her felt just a little too close. Every reflection in a shop window felt just a little too slow to vanish. Was it paranoia? Maybe, but maybe not. Aisha gripped her bag tighter, heart pounding against her ribs, and kept moving forward. Somewhere out there, Vernon Hayes was hiding something, and she was getting closer. The boardroom gleamed under the sharp fluorescence of morning. Polished oak table, walls of glass, a skyline that stretched into forever. Aisha stood at the head of the table, the remote in her hand steady, her voice even smoother. Slide after slide clicked into place. Profit margins, projected growth, strategic leverage. Executives leaned forward, nodding. Questions were thrown like darts, sharp, quick, demanding. And Aisha caught each one with ease. No stutters, no missteps. The weight of expectation pressed down, but she wore it like tailored silk. When she clicked to the final slide, a bold projection of record gains, there was a pause, and then applause. The head of the division rose, crossing the room with an outstretched hand. Brilliant work, Johnson, he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. This could secure us the largest account of the year. Cameras flashed, hands clapped her back. She smiled, gracious, poised. But inside, another world tugged at her seams. That night, she sat alone in her room again, the golden desk lamp flickering at the edges. The walls here didn't shine. They absorbed light and worry alike. Another file spread open before her. Shipment records cross-referenced against offshore accounts. Beside her laptop, her phone buzzed with a coded message from the private investigator. Hayes meeting someone tonight, possible handoff. She rubbed her eyes, the thrill of the day's victory already fading like mist. 2 lives, one wrapped in sharp suits and confident handshakes, the other cloaked in quiet fear and relentless pursuit. In one world, she was the rising star, a symbol of what hard work could achieve. In the other, she was a shadow, moving quietly against forces she barely understood. Every morning she built, every night she hunted, and both worlds demanded everything she had. The city beyond her window pulsed with life, horns blaring, lights flickering like restless stars. Somewhere in that chaos, Vernon Hayes was moving his pieces, believing no one was watching. Aisha closed the file. Tomorrow would bring another meeting, another crisp suit, another polished smile. But tonight she was something else entirely. A warrior, silent, focused, unseen. She reached for her phone and texted Clara back. I'm ready, let's move. And in the stillness that followed, Aisha felt it, that thin, burning line between who she was and who she was becoming. The first thing Aisha noticed when she reached her door that night was the silence. Too deep, too heavy. Her hand froze midway to the lock. It was splintered, barely hanging onto the frame, as if someone had tried and almost succeeded to break in. A cold blade of fear slid down her spine. She didn't open the door. She backed away, phone trembling in her grip, heart thundering against her ribs. The threats were no longer words on paper. They had teeth now. They were close, too close. An hour later, Aisha sat stiffly in a hard plastic chair under the fluorescent lights of a hospital waiting room. The air smelled of bleach and old coffee. The walls were washed in colors meant to be soothing, but under this light, they only looked sickly. Mark paced in front of her, running a hand through his hair again and again. Clara sat beside Aisha, her phone buzzing intermittently with updates. Lily collapsed, Mark said for the third time, voice raw. Too much stress. She wasn't supposed to. He broke off, swallowing hard. Aisha closed her eyes for a second, pushing back her own storm of fear and guilt. They were running out of time, running out of safety. We can't wait anymore, she said, voice low but fierce. We take it to the police, now. Mark stopped pacing. Clara looked up from her phone. Are you sure? Clara asked, her face drawn. If we go now, there's no going back. I'm sure, Aisha said. We move. The city pulsed under a cloudy night sky, the streets wet and gleaming under streetlights. At the far edge of town, a grimy warehouse squatted at the end of a deserted street, its windows dark, its gates chained. Police cruisers lined up silently in the shadows, engines humming low. Blue and red lights stayed off, for now. Aisha watched from a safe distance, her fists clenched in her coat pockets. Clara stood beside her. Mark, pale but determined, lingered just behind. Through a police radio crackle, the word came, gung. Suddenly the night exploded into action. Sirens shrieked to life. Blue and red lights sliced through the darkness, painting the walls in frantic colors. Officers stormed the building, guns drawn, voices cutting through the chaos. A scuffle, shouts, and then 2 men dragged out in handcuffs. Vernon Hayes stumbled against the asphalt, his face slack with disbelief as he was shoved into the back of a cruiser. Behind him, crates cracked open under police hands, glittering stones, fake invoices, hidden ledgers spilling out like secrets too long kept. Aisha watched it all, her breath misting in the cold air. The danger wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, the noose was tightening. Not around her, but around the men who deserved it. Hope flickered inside her, fragile, fierce, and burning brighter by the second. The hospital room was small but glowing with warmth. Morning light spilled through the half-open blinds, soft and golden, casting gentle halos around the figures inside. Lily lay propped up against crisp white pillows, her cheeks flushed with exhaustion and joy. In her arms, wrapped tightly in a pink blanket, was a tiny, perfect baby, Hope. Mark hovered close, one hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder, his other hand stroking the baby's impossibly small fingers. Aisha stood by the door for a moment, hesitant. It felt like stepping into a world she wasn't sure she had the right to enter. But when Lily looked up and saw her, her whole face lit up. "Come here," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Aisha crossed the room, her heels quiet against the polished floor, and sat down in the chair next to the bed. Closer now, she could see every detail. The flutter of Hope's tiny chest, the downy curl of hair at her forehead. "Would you like to hold her?" Lily asked. Aisha blinked, her throat tightening. I'd love to." Carefully, Lily placed Hope into her arms. The baby stirred, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips, and nestled closer. Aisha gazed down at the tiny face, wonder and tenderness blooming in her chest so fiercely it almost hurt. In all the chaos, the threats, the sleepless nights, this was what it had all been meant for, life, new, fragile, and limitless. "You're family now," Mark said, his voice rough with sincerity. "You always will be." Aisha looked up, blinking away sudden tears, and saw it. Not pity, not obligation, but belonging. Not just because she had helped them, but because she had chosen to care. Because in a world full of reasons to look away, she hadn't. Hope's hand, no bigger than a plum, curled instinctively around Aisha's finger. A tiny grip, a quiet promise. And as the morning light bathed the room in gold, Aisha allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that sometimes kindness didn't just change lives, it built new ones. Atlanta greeted her with a misty dawn, the streets still heavy with sleep. Aisha stepped out of the terminal, suitcase in hand, the cool air brushing against her cheeks like a whispered welcome home. She moved through the quiet crowd, her steps unhurried, her mind already drifting toward the life she had left behind. Deadlines, meetings, expectations. But then she saw her. A young woman at the curb, struggling with a suitcase that refused to cooperate, its wheels snagging, jerking, refusing to roll. Passengers streamed past her, eyes averted, each lost in their own world. Aisha paused, For a moment, she simply watched. The frustration, the quiet battle against something so small, so stubborn. It would be easy to keep walking, to slip back into the rhythm of her own busy life. Instead, she smiled, a small, knowing smile, and crossed the few steps between them. "Need a hand?" she asked gently. The woman looked up, startled, and then relieved, and nodded. Together, they wrangled the suitcase onto steadier ground. A tiny thing, a fleeting moment. But as Aisha straightened and the first rays of sunlight broke through the gray clouds above, she felt it again. That invisible thread that tied strangers together when kindness passed between them. Because sometimes the smallest gesture isn't small at all.